The schoolhouse door swung open at 6 o'clock in the evening of the 27th of March, 1882, and a thin, pale-cheeked woman in a charcoal-gray wool dress and a heavy cream wool shawl stepped out into the lantern-lit mouth of a sod tunnel, hand in hand with 7 children. The children were thin under their wool coats, but they walked steady. The smallest of them was a 6-year-old Italian girl named Maria, with dark plaits down her back, and she held the right hand of the woman, and the woman's left hand was held by a 6-year-old Welsh boy named Hywel, who was her own younger son. Behind them in single file came 5 more. An 8-year-old Welsh boy named Idris carrying his small school slate, a 10-year-old Welsh girl named Annie with a tin pencil case in her apron pocket, a 9-year-old Welsh boy named Davy in his father's outgrown wool cap, a 7-year-old Welsh girl named Sarah with a small leather Bible pressed to her chest, and an 8-year-old Norwegian boy named Sven holding a folded woolen blanket over his shoulder. They walked out of the schoolhouse and into the warm orange glow of 14 tin oil lanterns, and a tall, bearded coal miner with red-rimmed eyes stepped forward in the lantern light, and he said her name once. This was Catrin Jones of the Carbon-No. 2 schoolhouse of Carbon, Wyoming Territory in the early spring of the year 1882. The man whose voice had broken on her name was her husband, Davy Jones, 32 years of age, born in the slate-quarry village of Bethesda in Caernarfonshire, North Wales, and brought to the Wyoming Territory in the year 1869 with his elder brother Owain and his late father Hywel the Elder, who had been a quarryman of the Penryn slate works of Lord Penryn before the great strike that broke the families. David had been a coal miner of the Union Pacific seam at Carbon for 12 years, a deacon of the Carbon Capel Mawr of the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists, and a quiet man with a steady hand. He had married Catrin Llewellyn of the Welsh chapel village of Bala in the spring of 1872 at the Carbon Capel Mawr, and they had welcomed Idris in the autumn of 1873, and Hywel 4 years after. Catrin had taught the Carbon-No. 2 schoolhouse since the autumn of 1879, walking the 3 miles east along the wagon trace from their cottonwood and sod cabin on the south slope of Allen Hill to the small frame schoolhouse beside Hannah Spring. She had taken Idris and Hywel with her on the morning of the 14th. The morning had been clear and cold. The big storm of 1882 broke against the southern Wyoming Territory at 11 o'clock that morning, 60 hours of solid blizzard, drifts running 12 to 15 feet along the Carbon-Hanna corridor, the porch thermometer at the Jones cabin holding at -38 for 9 days. The storm cut the wagon trace east of David's cabin in the first hour. Catrin had not come home that night. David had set out for the schoolhouse at noon on the 14th in his heavy oilskin and his father's tin oil lantern, but he had turned back at 300 yards. The drift along the trace was already chest-high at the rim of his own quarter section. He had sat through the next 60 hours in his own kitchen with the cook stove burning hard and the gray wool blanket pinned across the south window, and he had heard the wind take the chimney cap off the south chimney in the small hours of the 15th. He had laid out his father's tin oil lantern on the kitchen table, and he had laid out Catrin's small ivory hairbrush of her grandmother's on the table beside it, and he had laid out Idris's small school slate from his grandfather's quarry days, and Hywel's small carved wooden lamb from the Lanroust Christmas market on the table beside the hairbrush, and he had sat in the kitchen chair across from the 4 objects through the second night of the storm with the cook stove burning hard and the wind taking the south wall of the cabin in long, slow, sustained shudders. He had said the 84th Psalm aloud at 2:30 in the morning of the 16th into the empty kitchen, in the quiet, old, soft Bethesda voice his mother had given him, and he had said the names of his wife and his 2 sons aloud after each verse. On the morning of the 17th of March, the Sunday morning of the storm, he had heard the chapel bell ring at the Carbon village a mile west, and he had gone out into the snow to follow the sound of it. He came into the chapel at 10:30 in the morning of the 17th, in his oilskin caked white with rime, and he stood at the back of the warm-lit nave under the gas lamp with his cap in his hands, and he asked Pastor Aled Williams whether any word had come of the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse. Pastor Williams shook his gray head. The chapel deacon, Llewellyn Pritchard, 54 years of age, slate quarryman of the old Penryn school, set down his leather-bound Welsh hymnal of Canidid Sinulaid Newid on the deacon's bench, and rose and put his hand on David's shoulder. He said in Welsh, in his quiet old Bethesda accent, that no word had come from any house east of the Carbon coal tip, and that no rider had been able to ride out, and that the wagon trace was buried clean. He said the chapel would meet that afternoon to take the matter in hand. The Carbon village met in the chapel at 3 o'clock that afternoon. 18 Welsh coal miners and their wives and the Norwegian Union Pacific Section foreman, Magnus Fjellstad, and the Italian coal miner, Giovanni Bottini, who were the fathers of 2 of the children at the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse. They sat in the pews under the gas lamp, and Pastor Aled Williams said the 84th Psalm, and old Pugh rose to speak. Pugh was 66 years of age and a retired Penryn quarryman of the old Drystone Arching School, and he had been the man who had laid the chapel's south foundation arch in 1873. He said in Welsh that the wagon trace would not clear before the 4th of April, and that the wind would take the wagon trace through 3 more storms before then, and that there were 9 of them, and the schoolmistress Catrin Jones at the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse, and that no horse and no man would walk those 3 miles in the open air that month. He set his quarryman's flat pencil down on the deacon's bench, and he said the only road they would have to the schoolhouse was a road they would have to dig through the drift themselves, and that he had laid arched dry stone tunnels at the Penryn quarry 40 years before, and that what would hold in slate could be made to hold in packed snow and prairie sod if a man knew the keystone. Davy Jones rose then and said in Welsh that he would dig the tunnel if they would have him, and that the work could begin in the morning of the 18th, and that he asked the chapel's help. Llewellyn Pritchard set his hand again on David's shoulder, and he said the chapel would dig with him. Magnus Fjellstad said in his thick Norwegian accented English that his boy Sven was at the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse, and that he would dig with them. Giovanni Bottini said in his thick Genoese accented English that his daughter Maria was at the schoolhouse, and that he would dig with them. Tomos Hopkins, whose 10-year-old daughter Annie was at the schoolhouse, said he would dig. Glyn Jenkins, whose 9-year-old son Davy was at the schoolhouse, said he would dig. Pastor Aled Williams sent the 2 best riders of the chapel, both young Welshmen of the Hanna seam, out the south road that very afternoon to fetch David's elder brother Owain Jones from the Hanna camp 4 miles east, and to fetch what hands would come from Hanna for the work. The chapel sang the 84th Psalm, and David Jones sat in the south corner of the kitchen of the chapel, with a plate of Welsh cake set on the bench beside him by Pastor Williams's wife, and he could not lift his head. The tin oil lantern of his father, brought across the ocean from Bethesda in the year 1869, sat beside the Welsh cake on the bench. Pastor Williams's wife, a soft-spoken Welshwoman named Megan Williams of the chapel village, sat beside David on the bench and laid her hand on his shoulder for a long, quiet minute. And she said in Welsh, in her soft Bala voice, that the chapel had Catrin's name in its prayer book that morning, and would have it there every morning until the schoolhouse was reached, and that the chapel kitchen would feed every man who set a hand to the cut. David Jones lifted his head, and he looked at the Welsh cake on the plate, the small, flat brown cake of his mother's recipe, and he could not eat it. He set his hand on the warm tin shoulder of his father's lantern, and he said in Welsh, in the quiet old Bethesda voice, that he would have her out by the end of the month. The first day of digging was the 18th of March. Pugh set the first arch with a wooden plumb bob at the western rim of the snow-buried wagon, traced 90 yards east of the chapel village, between two split cottonwood markers driven into the snowpack. The arch was 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide at the floor, with a packed snow keystone, and walls of laid-up prairie sod chunks cut from the south slope of Allen Hill and trimmed to the curve of the arch. The arched cross-section followed the dry stone arching method that Pugh had laid 40 years before in the Penryn quarry tunnels, scaled down for sod and packed snow. The packed snow keystone was set with the broad face down and trimmed flush. The sod chunks were laid stem-side up in courses, 3 to the side and a single keystone at the top, with the lime and clay packing of fresh prairie clay troweled into the joints. A tin oil lantern was hung from a notched sod peg at 30-yard intervals along the tunnel ceiling. The first day they dug 70 yards. The second day they dug 120 yards. The third day they dug 160 yards. By the morning of the 20th of March, there were 12 of them digging from the western end, and the tunnel had reached 340 yards east of the chapel village. The cold along the trace held at -36. The men dug in 3-hour shifts so that no man stayed in the cold cut for more than 3 hours at a stretch. Pastor Aled Williams kept the chapel kitchen warm, and the deacon's wife kept the Welsh cake plate heaped, and Llewellyn Pritchard rode the relay of fresh men in and out of the cut every 3 hours. David's elder brother, Wyoming Jones, rode in from Hanna at sundown of the 19th, with 2 Norwegian section hands and an Italian coal miner who had worked the dynamite shot at the Hanna seam the autumn before. Owain was 38 years of age, taller than David and broader, with the same soft Bethesda voice. He held David's shoulders for a long minute in the chapel kitchen before he said anything, and then he said in Welsh that they would have her out by the end of the month. The fourth day was the 21st. The cut reached 540 yards. Old Pugh walked the tunnel with his quarryman's flat pencil at sundown and marked the keystones that wanted re-trimming. The south wall of the cut was sweating slightly under the lantern heat by then, and the keystone of the third 100-yard arch had a hairline crack. Pugh trimmed it back 2 inches and reset it with fresh prairie clay. He said in Welsh that the trimming was good and that the wall would hold 3 more days. He was wrong. On the morning of the 6th day of digging, the 22nd of March, the south wall of the tunnel between the 400-yard mark and the 450-yard mark gave way under the weight of an unexpected fresh drift that had built overnight along the south rim. The collapse came at 9:30 in the morning. Wyoming Jones was at the cut face when it came, and the 2 Norwegian section hands were behind him. 500 cubic feet of packed snow and sod fell on the three of them in less than a minute. The lanterns went out. David Jones was at the chapel kitchen drinking tea with Pastor Williams when the runner came, and he was through the chapel door before the runner had finished the sentence. He ran the 400 yards through the lantern-lit cut in his shirt sleeves with no oilskin and no cap and no gloves, and he reached the collapse face in 7 minutes. Llewellyn Pritchard was already there with a tin oil lantern and 3 diggers and the long-handled snow shovels. They dug for 19 minutes by Pastor Williams's pocket watch before they came to the first Norwegian section hand. He was breathing. They dug for 8 more minutes and came to the second Norwegian section hand. He was breathing. They dug for 14 more minutes and they came to Owain Jones. He was breathing too, but his right boot was wedged under a sod chunk the size of a barrel, and the foot inside the boot was cold blue at the calf. They cut the boot off in the cut by the lantern light, and they carried Owain back the 400 yards to the chapel kitchen on a folded oilskin, and Pastor Williams's wife laid him on the deacon's bench and warmed his foot in soft, tepid water from the kettle for the better part of an hour. The foot did not come back. Owain's right foot below the ankle was lost to the frost. The chapel doctor, a Welshman named Daniel Pritchard, who had ridden in from Hanna with the second relay, said the foot would have to come off above the ankle. He took it off that evening on the deacon's bench with the chapel quiet and Owain holding David's left hand. The second blizzard broke against the Carbon village at midnight of the 22nd. It blew 30 hours and it laid down a fresh 7 inches of snow on top of the existing pack. They lost the 23rd and the 24th of March entirely. On the morning of the 25th, with the cut at 440 yards and the schoolhouse still 2.5 miles east, Thomas Hopkins came into the chapel kitchen and said in Welsh that the rally would have to wait for the spring breakup, that no man could dig the remaining 2.5 miles in time, that they had lost a foot and almost 3 lives in one collapse, and that the second storm was a sign, and that they should turn the rally to setting out spring relief riders the moment the wind broke. Old Tom Pugh sat with his cap in his hands and said in Welsh that Thomas Hopkins was speaking sense. David Jones said in Welsh that he would dig alone if no man else would, and that he had heard his wife's voice in the cut on the morning of the 22nd before the wall came down, and that if she had been at the schoolhouse on the morning of the 22nd, then she would still be at the schoolhouse on the morning of the 25th, and she would still be alive on the morning of the 2nd of April when the breakup came, and she would not. Giovanni Bottini, the Italian coal miner of the Hanna seam, sat at the south end of the deacon's bench beside Owain Jones, and he said in his thick, Genoese-accented English that he had a method. He said in his coal miner's broken English that at the Hanna seam they shot the coal with dynamite from 2 faces at the same time, working toward each other from the 2 ends of a drift, and that the work went 4 times faster, and that he would walk the 4 miles east to the Hanna Spring, where the wagon trace climbed the low ridge above the schoolhouse, and that he would set a relief shot of 3 sticks of dynamite into the bank above the schoolhouse east rim, and that he would open a cut from the east end of the schoolhouse moving west, and that David's western team would dig east toward him, and that they would meet in the middle in 5 days. Owain Jones lifted his head from the deacon's bench and said in Welsh through clenched teeth that he would walk the east cut on a crutch with Giovanni from the Hanna Spring relief shot, and that he had not lost a foot to sit by a stove. Old Tom Pugh set his cap back on his head and said in Welsh that the dual-end method was the right method, and that he had seen the Penryn quarryman drive a gallery from 2 faces in 1841 and bring it together within a foot. Pastor Aled Williams stood and said the prayer of the 84th Psalm. Giovanni Bottini and Wyoming Jones and 4 Hanna men set out for the Hanna Spring on the morning of the 25th in the cold, pale blue light after the second storm. They carried 6 sticks of dynamite, 3 tin oil lanterns, 2 long-handled snow shovels, a single coil of stout jute rope, a small wooden box of 24 iron sod pegs, and a tarred canvas sack of Welsh cake from Pastor Williams's wife. Owain rode his bay mare with his crutch lashed to the saddle horn. They reached the Hanna Spring at 3 in the afternoon, and they laid the relief shot at 4. The dynamite opened a clean east cut into the snowbank above the wagon trace. By sundown of the 25th, Giovanni Bottini's east team had cut 140 yards back toward the schoolhouse and was within 70 yards of the schoolhouse east rim. The schoolhouse was a small frame building of clapboard and shingle, 20 feet by 24, with a single brick chimney rising from a small school cook stove against the north wall. The cook stove had been laid up by the stove makers of Cheyenne in 1878. The schoolhouse coal bin held 1 ton of carbon-mined slack at the start of the storm. The 4th day of the dual-end work was the 26th. The western team reached the 700-yard mark, and the eastern team reached the schoolhouse east rim. Giovanni Bottini and Wyoming Jones tunneled through the snow against the schoolhouse east clapboard at noon of the 26th and rapped twice on the wall with the back of a snow shovel. There was a long quiet, and then a thin, small voice from inside the schoolhouse rapped twice back. It was the voice of Maria Bottini, 6 years old, the daughter of Giovanni Bottini. Giovanni Bottini sat down in the snow against the east clapboard and wept quietly into his bare hands for the better part of 3 minutes. They did not break the wall through that day. They cut a small access shaft along the east clapboard down to the south door, and they cleared the south doorway and the south porch, and they hung 4 tin oil lanterns at the schoolhouse south door, and they sent a single Hanna runner back the 700 yards to the western cut to call Davy Jones to come east. The 5th day of the dual-end work was the 27th of March, 1882. The western team broke through to the eastern team at the 1100-yard mark at 4 in the afternoon. The 2 cuts met within 9 inches of each other in line, and old Tom Pugh's prediction held. Llewellyn Pritchard set the last arch and the last keystone. The tunnel ran a measured 3 miles and 47 yards from the Chapel Village western rim to the schoolhouse south door, and a straight count showed 86 tin oil lanterns hung from sod pegs along its ceiling. The tunnel was warm with the lantern heat. Davy Jones was at the western end at the moment of the breakthrough. He took his father's tin oil lantern from his belt, and he walked the last 500 yards alone, slow, the lantern raised at shoulder height, his cap in his other hand. He came to the eastern end, and he stepped out of the tunnel mouth into the small, cleared south doorway of the schoolhouse. And he raised his hand to knock on the door, and the door opened from the inside before he had touched it. Catrin Jones stood at the doorway in her charcoal gray wool dress and her heavy cream wool shawl, her chestnut brown hair pinned in a low knot under a small black knit kerchief. Her face was thin and pale. She had her grandmother's small silver chapel cross from Bala on a thin black silk cord at her throat. She looked at her husband for a long, quiet moment in the lantern light, and then she stepped back and she said in Welsh, in her old soft Bala voice, "Come in, Cariad." The 7 children of the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse were arrayed along the west wall of the schoolroom in a single row on the school benches, wrapped in folded woolen blankets. The school cook stove was burning soft against the north wall. A small iron kettle was steaming on the stove top. A single small leather Bible lay open on Catrin's desk. The school coal bin was nearly empty. Catrin Jones had taught the Carbon-No. 2 schoolhouse through 23 days of the Big Storm of 1882 with no word of the outside world, and with a single ton of carbon coal slack, and a small store of lard and rolled oats, and a half-pound box of tea, and a small jar of honey, and the 7 children in her charge. She had set the children to sleep on the school benches under the blankets in pairs, head to foot. She had rationed the lard and the oats by spoonfuls measured into the small iron kettle each morning and each evening. Half a tablespoon of lard and 3 tablespoons of rolled oats per child per meal, with a thin pinch of honey on Sunday mornings, and a single small cup of weak tea each evening for warmth. She had taught the children their Welsh hymns and their letters and the 84th Psalm by the warm amber light of a single tin schoolhouse oil lantern. She had kept the school cook stove burning continuously through 23 days, banking the fire each evening with a single carbon coal lump set under fine ash. She had set Idris, 8 years old, to keep the woodshed door clear of drift and to fetch a fresh coal lump every 6 hours through the day shift. She had set Annie Hopkins, 10 years old, to read aloud from the small leather Bible at the morning hour from the 84th Psalm and the 126th Psalm. She had set Sven Fjellstad, 8 years old, to teach the others a Norwegian counting song from his mother of Bergen. She had set Maria Bottini, 6 years old, to fetch the kettle from the stove and to sing the small Italian lullaby of her mother of Genoa at the noon hour. She had set Davy Jenkins, 9 years old, to lay the school benches end to end against the south wall each morning, to clear the schoolroom for the children's hour of stretching and walking. She had set Sarah Pugh, 7 years old, to keep the small leather Bible warm against her chest through the cold of each night. She had set Hywel, 6 years old, to sing the Welsh hymn Carbon-Hanna at the evening hour, and to learn its second verse by heart from the small hymn book of her grandmother of Bala that she had kept in her teaching bag through the storm. She had not lost a child. The 7 children walked out of the schoolhouse south door at 6 o'clock in the evening of the 27th of March, 1882. And they walked into the lantern-lit mouth of the sod tunnel, hand in hand with their schoolmistress, Catrin Jones, and they walked the 3 miles west by the warm light of the 86 tin oil lanterns of the carbon sod tunnel. They walked single file in the order their mothers and fathers had asked at the chapel meeting 9 days before. The children sang the Welsh hymn Carbon-Hanna through the long, warm tunnel, and the men of the rally walked behind them with their snow shovels held at port arms and their caps in their hands. They came out at the western rim of the chapel village at 7:30 in the evening, into the small lantern-lit yard of the Carbon Capel Mar. And the chapel was full, and the gas lamp was lit, and Pastor Aled Williams stood in the doorway in his Sunday black wool coat and clean white linen collar with his hands folded at his waist. He said the prayer of the 126th Psalm in Welsh, the psalm of those that sow in tears, reaping in joy. The chapel sang Carbon-Hanna 3 times through. David Jones held his wife's hand at the back of the nave and could not sing. Owain Jones sat at the south corner of the chapel kitchen on the deacon's bench with his crutch propped beside him and his right trouser leg pinned at the knee. He held his wife Eluned Jones in his lap, and he did not let her go. Giovanni Bottini held his small daughter Maria up at the window so that she could see the gas lamp burning, and he wept quietly into the crown of her head. Magnus Fjellstad held his small son Sven on his shoulders and walked him through the chapel, saying his name. Old Pugh sat at the south corner of the kitchen and drank his tea slowly and did not speak. Llewellyn Pritchard stood at the deacon's bench with his Welsh hymnal open at Calon and led the singing. The carbon sod tunnel was kept open by the chapel rally through the first week of April 1882 until the spring breakup ran. Catrin Jones taught the children of the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse from the chapel kitchen for the remainder of the term, and the schoolhouse was reopened on the first Monday after Whitsuntide. The Wyoming Big Storm of 1882 perished an estimated 240 Carbon County range cattle and 3 Albany County prairie homesteaders along the Hanna to Cheyenne wagon trace. None of the 7 children of the Carbon No. 2 schoolhouse was lost. Catrin Jones gave a small lecture at the chapel kitchen on the second Sunday after Easter on the rationing of lard and oats by the spoonful, and the lecture was published in the Welsh American journal Idris in autumn 1882 under the title The Schoolmistress at Carbon No. 2. The carbon sod tunnel arching method of Old Pugh was published as a folio drawing in Idris in the same autumn of 1882 and was adopted by Welsh chapel relief committees across Carbon and Albany counties, Wyoming Territory through the winters of 1883 and 1884. The dual-end dynamite relief method of Maria Bottini was adopted by the Hanna Coal Camp and by the Rock Springs Coal Camp for emergency coal tip rescue work through the same period. Owain Jones was fitted with a small wooden peg foot by the Cheyenne fitter Lewis Edwards in May 1882, and he walked the chapel kitchen and the deacon's bench until 1908, when he passed quietly at age 64 of a quiet heart failing in the chapel kitchen with his wife Ilunde beside him. Giovanni Bottini opened a small Italian bakery in Carbon Village in 1885 and ran it until 1922. Magnus Fjellstad rose to Union Pacific Section Superintendent of the Hanna Seam in 1894. David Jones and Catrin Jones lived in the cottonwood and sod cabin on the south slope of Allen Hill for the rest of their married life. Idris Jones grew to be a Welsh Calvinistic Methodist minister of the Carbon Capel Mar from 1898 to 1934. Hywel Jones grew to be a Welsh Calvinistic Methodist minister of the Hanna Chapel from 1903 to 1937. David Jones passed quietly at age 74 in the spring of 1924 in the same cottonwood and sod cabin with the tin oil lantern of his father set beside the kitchen window. Catrin Jones passed quietly at age 86 in the autumn of 1936 in the same cottonwood and sod cabin with her grandmother's small silver chapel cross of Bala set on her granddaughter's wrist. The tin oil lantern of Hywel Jones, the elder of Bethesda, was donated to the Wyoming Pioneer Museum at Douglas in 1938 by Idris Jones the minister, and the small silver chapel cross of Capel Mar Bala passed down through the family of the Jones-Llewellyn line into the hands of the great-great-granddaughter of Catrin Jones at Laramie, Wyoming, in the spring of 1976. The arched sod and snow tunnel of the Carbon Sod Tunnel Rally of 1882 melted clean in the breakup of April 1882 and was not laid again. The chapel rally of the Carbon Capel Mar of the Welsh Calvinistic Methodists of Carbon, Wyoming Territory, met every spring on the second Sunday after Easter through the year 1934 and read the names of the 7 children and the names of the 22 diggers of the Carbon Sod Tunnel of the Big Storm of 1882, and sang Calon Lan 3 times through.